And that's why I'm asking that we become allies and ambassadors. You've heard me use that word this year. But imagine if in our classrooms that we had neurodiversity allies. We had young children who understood and supported the people with neurodiversity in their classroom, whether they have autism or dyslexia. Imagine if instead of the child having to always speak up for themselves, that other people spoke up and said, oh, I think this noise could be upsetting for Jessica. Or, how can we be more supportive? Instead of the stuff I get like, it's not fair. Why have they got the sensory tool? Imagine if our neurotypical children went, Jackson needs the sensory tools and didn't even question it. They understood that neurodiverse children actually needed access to that or needed to wear their headphones, and they didn't think anything different of it. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Sue Larkey podcast. As I always say, you have to embrace difference to make a difference. Let's dive into today's podcast. Well, welcome everybody. As you know, the start of my podcast always says, embrace difference to make a difference. April is Autism Awareness Month, although a lot of us don't like the term awareness. We like acceptance. And in fact, I think we're moving beyond that. And I'm going to say that I want April to be Autism Ally Month, where all of us ally and support neurodiverse people, giving them the supports and understanding that they deserve, really. So I often think my students are the bravest students. If I live with the amount of anxiety, being so misunderstood often, that I would find it hard to get out of bed. I actually would probably hide under my doona if I didn't have social connection at school but wanted social connection. If I constantly felt like I wasn't completing work, many of my children don't get to experience finishing and misunderstand cues both from teachers and their peers. So I'm moving towards autism. Well, actually, neurodiversity is my preferred word. But if it's going to be autism, then I think autism allies, just like Pride now, we're having so many amazing conversations around sexuality, but also for the rest of us to be proud. I always, march with people, be proud of people, go out and celebrate like Mardi Gras. Imagine if we could have that for neurodiversity. And I think we're coming a long way. Like Heartbreak High, if you haven't watched that, with Chloe Hayden, who is such a strong advocate, but it's so wonderful to see Chloe playing an autistic person in a show like Heartbreak High that teenagers are going to watch and see her diversity, how her friends are so supportive and understanding. I mean, Heartbreak High has so many diverse people on it and in all sorts of areas, and I would love neurodiversity to be out and proud, and kids to be proud of being neurodiverse, and parents to be comfortable telling their child they're neurodiverse when they get a diagnosis rather than being worried. I don't know. You know me. I'm talking to you like we're having a cup of tea or a coffee in a shop, and we're sharing our thoughts. And I guess this podcast is more a little bit of a rambling and a conversation and a thought provoker about, well, what can we do during April to make a difference? How do we want the future to look? I mean, Love on the Spectrum, what a great show that shows so many diverse people on the spectrum, but also it shows wanting relationships and connection, which is so misunderstood because so often people don't understand how much neurodiverse people are. I'm just struggling lately. Whenever, I think I've said this to you before, but when I say person with autism or autistic person, I use the same interchangeably because people have different preferences. And I think just like anything, we need to ask people their preference. And it's the same with the LGBTQI community. We need to ask what word you want to be called, queer, trans, So it's a personal preference. And I think autism spectrum disorder should be a personal preference too. And I think you've heard me say before that my birth name's Susan, but I prefer to be called Sue. And when people ask me what I prefer to be called and they still call me Susan, I get cranky. So I think we need to ask people their personal preference. So if you're listening and you have a personal preference, fantastic. But some people change their personal preferences too. So I know some children who used to be called, like to be called Aspies, but now like neurodiverse. Personally, I have loved the term neurodiverse for a long time. In fact, I was looking and one of my first podcasts, like episode 14, which is nearly over, like we're up to nearly 200 episodes. So it's nearly four or 5 years ago, I used the term neurodiverse. And in that podcast, I had to actually explain like what is neurodiversity. And I said, it's the concept of neurological differences between people that should be recognized and respected. Instead of using terms like dysfunction or disability or disorders, neurodiversity is an enabling term that takes into account neurological differences. Neurodiversity isn't a one-size-fits-all. And I feel like we are all different and should celebrate our differences in the neurodiversity. Sorry, not we, as in neurodiversity all looks different for each individual. And my experience is neurodiversity doesn't just, like, it's very rare you just have autism. It might be autism and auditory processing, auditory and dyslexia. You know, that it's a combination, and that's why I love the term neurodiversity. And when I talked about it back in episode 14, I created this lovely visual that I'll put in again this time, because neurodiversity, you might have epilepsy, you might have OCD, you might have, sensory integration disorder. You might have a combination of things. And this is where I feel like Neurodiversity Month is probably a better term for it. But I saw on Facebook a lovely term that, lovely post that an autistic person put up saying, just for autistic people to answer, what do you want to call April or wish it was called? And a hashtag asking autistics instead of autism awareness. And the number of autistic people who put April. And if you think of the literalness of people with autism spectrum, this is perfect to call it April. I think that's hysterical. What do you want it to be called? The month of April, call it April. I hope this makes sense on the podcast. But my point is this, that is the other thing that isn't talked about enough. The sense of humour of the children that I know is fantastic, and the young adults. I think we've started to talk more about wanting those relationships. I think we should also talk about humour, because all of my children have the most amazing humour, and I haven't taught a student yet that I haven't and it's sort of a discovery. Often once their anxiety's down and they're calm and relaxed and we have a relationship, I discover this would be some of the funniest children I have ever taught. Like, look at Hannah Gatsby, who is a spokesperson for Yellow Ladybugs. Her Netflix special, I think, is one of the biggest downloaded Netflix comedy, both of her Netflix. So there is a number of comedians who are on the spectrum. So I think as part of our neurodiversity ally, we need to celebrate the humour, celebrate the wanting connection, often in a different way. And I like what Dean Beadle says. It's not social skills, it's social knowledge. It's helping young people, particularly at school, understand how neurotypical people function. For example, many years ago, when Lawson and I were doing a presentation, and they got up and explained how they had to explain to their neurotypical child how neurodiverse people thought. Like, neurotypical people like to watch shows like Home and Away. Neurotypical people, like your sister, like to, wear different clothes, like to eat a range of foods. And they went through all the ways that a neurotypical person was a problem in a house for neurodiverse people. And I just think that is very, very clever. I'm not being as funny as Wen was, but the way Wen phrased it just made so much sense. If you have 4 neurodiverse people in a house and 1 neurotypical person, the neurotypical person the neurodiverse people have to understand the neurotypical person, in the same way that we often have to reverse that in the classroom, that we need our neurotypical neurotypical children to understand our neurodiverse children. And that's why I'm asking that we become allies and ambassadors. You've heard me use that word this year. But imagine if in our classrooms that we had neurodiversity allies. We had young children who understood and supported the people with neurodiversity in their classroom, whether they have autism or dyslexia. Imagine if instead of the child having to always speak up for themselves, that other people spoke up and said, oh, I think this noise could be upsetting for Jessica. Or, how can we be more supportive? Instead of the stuff I get like, it's not fair. Why have they got the sensory tool? Imagine if our neurotypical children went, Jackson needs the sensory tools and didn't even question it. They understood that neurodiverse children actually needed access to that or needed to wear their headphones, and they didn't think anything different of it. Just like we have come so far with so many other things in our conversations and understanding of differences. Imagine if we could embrace difference to make a difference. Imagine if children and adults and parents embrace that difference. So what I have learnt, though, when I go into classrooms, we often underestimate how supportive the peers can be. My doctorate research found that years ago, that often the other children were opening books, handing pencils, helping the child. But I think we can go to another level of where all of us are allies for neurodiverse children and adults, and actually really embrace that difference, which I've talked about for a long time. So I was thinking, okay, Sue, well, what can we do? Well, I think, encourage your kids to watch shows like Heartbreak High. If you're a parent, if you're a teacher listening, but you're a parent, why not encourage your children to watch those shows, or Love on the Spectrum, which gives so much insight, or Hannah Gatsby's Netflix specials, the comedy. But look at it through the lens of, well, what are you learning here so you can support a neurodiverse person you know? I love in Heartbreak High where Chloe's character is sensorily and overwhelmed, and her friend takes her into the bathroom at a party and just gives her the time and space she needs to regulate. Wouldn't that be beautiful if we could have more supportive advocates and allies in our young people? I think that would make a difference. So I was thinking, well, what are 10 things I would love people to understand? And I was looking through my tip sheets and my books, and I always put this tip sheet in my handouts, and I thought, I don't think I've talked about this for a long time. So I thought, I'm going to talk about this. What are 10 essential tips for understanding autism spectrum disorder? But you can adjust this to neurotypical, what are 10 essential tips? And although this says autism spectrum disorder, I don't tend to use that term anymore, but that is the World Health Organization's word. Most of us like the word autism spectrum condition, but I'm not the World Health Organization. I hope they change it, but I'm just acknowledging that, where possible, I try and use the words autism spectrum. So number one, the first thing I would love everyone to know is neurodiverse children do not have to look at you all the time. In fact, looking can be painful, and looking does not mean you're listening. I love what Yen Perkis said on her blog the other week. If looking was so important to understand, how do we talk on telephones? Let's face it, when you're on the phone, you are not looking at the person. So, and now everyone walks around with their ear pods in. My goodness, they're talking out loud to themselves half the time when you see people. It's hysterical. But you don't need to be able to see people, In fact, looking is not mean you're listening. So let's stop this having to look means to be listening, and looking is respectful. That is not true. Children with neurodiversity actually find looking very painful, and I call it their culture, looking does not, in fact, when they're looking at you, that can mean they can't listen. So imagine if children accepted that their peers didn't have to look at them all the time to be in a conversation or to be a good communicator. That's just a neurotypical rule we've made up. Number 2, give them time to answer your questions. This is so important, that take-up time, that processing time. Many of our children have auditory processing disorder, which means that they process slower. Those of you who have been to my workshops have heard me say that 80% of parents first go for a hearing test, but the hearing test comes back fine because it just goes beep, beep, and doesn't test your ability to understand. It tests your ability to hear. Imagine if all children understood that children process differently and that they process auditory differently and they need time to respond. Imagine if they knew to count to 10, to allow that child take up time. How nice would that be in our autism allies, in our children in schools understanding and supporting and being proud of the child actually thinking and engaging differently. Number 3, if they feel under pressure, they'll use stock standard answers, saying things like, I don't know, yes, maybe. This is so important because I see this a lot of the time where my children just say no even. They say no, but they haven't even thought about it. And then people think they changed their mind. What? They haven't changed their mind. They said, no, I don't want to do something. And then 5 minutes later they do. And I'll have adults say to me, they changed their mind. They said no. No was a stock standard answer. Or yes. Did you give them time to actually think about what it meant? And particularly if there's no visual supporting. So I've had it where a child will say, no, I don't want to play this game or do this activity. And then they see everyone else doing it and they want to do it because now they're seeing people doing it. They're seeing the visual. So maybe children, when they're asking children to join in a game, need to actually show them the game first, show them the ball, actually provide a visual support, actually say, do you want to come and have a look and see if you want to play? Wouldn't that be amazing? Do you want to come and have a look what we're doing and be part of it? And that would be one of the other things I would ask, even though I haven't put that on my top 10 things. It is easier if children go over and ask children to join in than my children asking to join in. Think of yourself. If people, if you initiate inviting friends out, that is harder than a friend ringing you and inviting you over. So imagine this month if you encourage children to invite a neurodiverse child over for a play date or invite them into a game or invite them into a group, or when you create pairs in your classroom, imagine the neurodiverse child actually someone else picks them rather than them going to the person and being rejected. I'd love you just to observe it. Just observe. Does this child get picked? Have they got children who include them? Well, how can we make sure they are? And I think it's easier if the neurotypical child goes over to the neurodiverse child. So how are we going to create autism allies? How are we going to have in April where children go up and initiate with our diverse children? I saw another thing on Facebook last week that said, instead of saying to your children, don't stare, why don't you say hello? How beautiful is that? Well, let's say hello to our diverse children this month. Let's go up and include them. Let's go up and talk to them. Let's go up and find out what they're interested in. If they love Star Wars, let them tell you about Star Wars or Pokemon or Lego. Let this child actually engage in their world. I hate that word world, but engage in what they're doing. Find out what they love. Because a lot of them are coming and asking us, yet we're not asking them. So how about we do that during Autism April or whatever we're going to call it? Number 5, they find organisation of their school equipment very difficult. So again, how about we teach our neurotypical child to check this child has a sharp pencil, check they know what they're doing, check they've got their book open to the right page. How about we support our neurodiverse children by teaching our neurotypical children to check in? Look, once you've opened your book and started work, check with another child, particularly our ADHD kids who often with their working memory can't remember what they need to be doing. And disorganization is part of ADHD. So if you have a child who's got a mess out over their table or their tote box a mess, why don't we ask a neurotypical child to show them how they sort their locker or how they sort their tote box, what they do to keep things tidy? Do they put the books in order, or how do they organize their pencil case? Many of my children would love someone to show them. And so often people just tell them not to make a big mess or to tidy up instead of showing them. So whether it's an adult showing them or their peers, let's actually show and do together. Number 6, limit their choices because they find choices overwhelming. No choice is a good choice for a diverse student. If you give them too many choices, they'll get overwhelmed, and often again, they'll swap between one and another. So I like to minimize choices. So instead of what are you going to do at lunchtime? Are you going to go on the equipment, or are you going to read a book or go to the library? Are you, instead of choose a partner, do you want to be with this child or that child? Instead of choose an activity off the shelf, do you want to do the puzzle or the colouring? Be more specific, clear and concise choices. Anna Tullermans always talks about with Daniel, if she said to him, when are you going to do your homework? He'd say later. And she'd say, are you going to do your homework at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock? So in the early childhood, if you're packing about the train set, instead of pack away, do you want to pack away the carriages or the tracks? If you're cleaning up, do you want to push in the chairs or pick up the books? Give them real choices this week or this month. During April, give real choices and model that for the children too, how to help this child with real choices. So be as clear and concise and concrete as possible. As I said, with that April, what do you want to call April? And many people on the spectrum said April. That is the literal thinking and often the humour. And again, Hannah Gatsby, if you watch the comedy special, you'll see her talking about her literal thinking and struggling with abstract thinking at school and how she really annoyed her teacher with her abstract thinking. So many of our children really, if people say, I had a ball on the weekend, imagine a ball. So many of our children have no idea what we mean because we don't say what we mean. And the big one actually leads into number 9 is where people say, would you like to do work? And they say no because it sounded like a choice. Could you do this? And they say no because could, would and can sound like a choice. Or people tell a child to stop rocking on their chair. So they stop rocking and start tapping their pen. They don't tell them what to do. Telling someone to stop doesn't tell them what to do. And I know I've talked about that a lot in my other podcasts, but maybe telling their peers that if you tell a child to stop because something's annoying you, you need to tell them what to do. You can't just say stop doing that. Actually, what were they doing? What was annoying you? Come up with a replacement together, yes? So often our language can be very confusing. And I think the words stop and no, a lot of peers misunderstand. So if a child says, no, you can't play with me, my children think never again. What you mean is, no, today I'm playing with Jessica, I'll play with you tomorrow. How about you get children to really explain what they mean by, like, no, you can't have a turn on the computer. I'm on the computer. You can have a turn after me, or so-and-so's after me. Ask them if you can go next. We tend to use the word no and assume people know what we mean. So I would encourage during April that we explain to people the literalness, that we need to be clear and concise. Tell the child what to do, not what not to do. So don't say, no, don't do that. Tell them what to do. So if a child's under the table, don't say, no, you can't be under the table. Say, sit in a chair. Or if a child's doing a behaviour that's annoying a peer, don't tell them stop it. Tell them to say, that noise is annoying me. Is there something else you can do? Can we get some blue tack or a sensory tool? Is there something else you can do? Or do you need to make that noise to help you calm? Oh, I can see that helps you calm. Well, for me, I don't really like that noise. Is there something we can come to a compromise? Like, have the conversation. Like, let's just talk about it. The next one is avoid verbal overload. And I mean, maybe you could talk about sensory in general. I mean, I always, when I have a class, talk about all our senses, like who likes certain foods, and we make a list of foods we like and don't like, who likes certain smells or don't, and often I have like coffee and vanilla, and we do all smelling of different things that I've learned over the years children don't often like the smell of. We might do a tasting, what tastes we don't like. The children normally know what foods they like and don't like without doing smelling. Often when I ask about smells, they don't know, especially younger children. But then if you get like coffee and things like that, and maybe like some strong spices, they actually will go, oh, no, I don't like that, or I like that. Vanilla, some people love it, some hate it. So you can do those. So you can do touch, taste, smell, movement. I like to do like who likes fast rides, whizzies, who doesn't. So we can go through all the senses and talk about different senses, and then talk to the class about how, well, imagine if you had a heightened sense of smell. Imagine if movement actually, you had the smallest movement can make you feel, unwell. That's one of those problems with wobble chairs. People seem to give them to all kids on the spectrum, and they don't work for all children. Can I tell you, some children don't like movement at all. You'll never catch them on the monkey bars or climbing up high. Some children love it, but we need to remember each child is very different. Okay, typical me, I'm jumping all around, but I highly recommend you print out the top 10 essential tips for understanding autism spectrum and neurodiversity. Put it up in your staff room, share with other people. But number 9 is simple changes in the environment can make a big difference. And I think we need to help children understand that for some of my neurodiverse children, they have facial blindness. So they don't recognize their friends if their friends put their hair up or if everyone's in the same uniform. Some of my children don't recognize them. So it's not just changes in environment, but it can be someone else sitting in their chair or someone sitting on their spot on the mat. That many of our neurodiverse children like the same spot, like the same chair. That being said, some like a change too. But I would love you to actually teach about neurodiversity during April. Things like the books, and you've heard me talk about them before. Can I tell you about autism? Can I tell you about Asperger's? Can I tell you about PDA? Or even reading books like The Red Beast about anger, the Panicosaurus about anxiety, or books like All Cats Are on the Autism Spectrum, All Dogs Have ADHD. Make sure you get the updated editions of those that are more gender neutral and have been updated in a much friendlier like using the right terminology. You know what I mean? We've come so far in the last 10 years since those books came out. So I highly recommend you get new copies of those because they are much loved books. So I guess I am saying is this April, let's celebrate neurodiversity. Let's be proud of our neurodiverse people, how brave they are, how incredible they are with their sensory, social, emotional differences, that we can embrace their difference to make a difference. And part of that is educating both the adults, so maybe putting something in your school newsletter, educating the peers, putting something in the newsletter or talking to them about these 10 tips, or maybe asking them, what do you know about neurodiversity? Why not just start a conversation like we do around many differences? Why not just start, what do you know? And maybe dispel some of their myths. Maybe if you have teenagers, getting them to watch Heartbreak High, talking about Chloe Hayden, having a look at Chloe's Facebook page, looking at Facebook pages by people like Dean Beadle, Yen Perkins, Wen Lawson, like actually exploring some people with lived experience, Temple Grandin, watching a movie like Thinking in Pictures, or reading her book, Thinking in Pictures. Why not, during April, as an opportunity for all of us to be allies, for all of us to be proud of our neurodiverse people, and also to celebrate the neurodiverse people in your community, to give them a chance to shine, give them a role in your school that lets them be the ambassador, whatever you want to do. Parents listening, how can you encourage your extended families to embrace and understand your child? Could you have a sensory-friendly birthday party, a sensory-friendly Easter this year? What would make an Easter hunt enjoyable for your child? What are the adaptations and accommodations that your family can put in place to make a difference so your child can be part of your family gathering? Maybe we need to think about that. And I would love all of you to think, what are some ways that we can all become allies during April and being a strong advocate and supporting our neurodiverse people? And I think the first step is encouraging everybody to understand neurodiversity is a different way of thinking, not a disorder, not a dysfunction. And I really like what Tony Attwood says. People with autism don't suffer from autism. They suffer from the attitudes of other people and how they treat them. So let's change our attitude during April. Let's make sure that everybody embraces difference to make a difference, whether it's family, friends, communities, schools. Please take a moment to download my tip sheet with the top 10 things that I sort of waffled through. And I hope that you can ensure that all of the young neurodiverse people in your community can be out and proud this April, and happy to say I'm neurodiverse, and people know what that means. And when you say to somebody, my child's autistic, they don't look autistic, because people understand there is no look of autism, how individual autism is. So when we say to someone, my child has ADHD or autism, we don't get dismissed. We get acknowledged, and that child gets accepted for their neurodiversity, and that neurotypical people are more accommodating and understanding and ally and stand together to support our beautiful neurodiverse community. I hope you've got some great tips and strategies to make a difference. Remember, strategies wear out, and not every strategy works for everybody. If you're ready to dive in deeper to more strategies and ideas to make a difference, I'd highly recommend you consider Dr. Tony Atwood or my online courses. For more information, visit my website www.sulaki.com.au.